So if you're like me, in some of your ministries, you're going to be dealing with people who maybe don't already think that they can trust the Bible. For me, that's usually youth kids or kids who are in college, young adults, people who are asking a lot of questions. They're confronted with new ideas, new truths, and they wonder whether or not the Bible is really a trustworthy source of information. Now, that's a pretty complicated question. And one of the things that people have done over the years, they've tried to prove that the Bible is this, they've tried to prove that the Bible is that. But I wonder if maybe there's a different way we can go about things. And so I want to, in this lecture, talk a little bit about the relationship between Scripture and experience, and really from the perspective of philosophy or theology of revelation. In your reading for this week, one of the major readings on this topic is from St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas believed very strongly in two basic ways that we learn things about the universe. There's natural reason, and then there's also revelation. And so for us, we would say that typically when we talk about revelation, we're talking about maybe Scripture. For those of us from more Pentecostal charismatic traditions, maybe prophetic words. For those of us who are a little less in that zone but still believe that God speaks, it might be inner promptings or a sense that the Spirit is saying something to us in our experience or through the wise counsel, something like that. And so we would think that there's some ways that we learn about the universe that aren't necessarily just based on our senses and what we can see and think and know. And so we might say, well, all right, let's ask a basic question. What can we know about the invisible, say the invisible God, without any help from God? And that's kind of where Aquinas starts in our reading. He's like, well, what can we know? And he's like, well, let's think about the world, right? Let's think about things that we know a lot about. So he gives the paradigm example in the ancient world of a triangle. He says, what you can do is you can look in the world. So you can walk around the world and you see things that are shaped certain ways, and eventually you begin to recognize that there's this kind of three-pointed shape that you recognize, and it's called a triangle, right? He's like, and you can draw this, you can reproduce it, you can start to look at it. And if you learn a few things about math, you can start to examine it, right? And you can say, well, hey, isn't it interesting that every circle has 360 degrees? And if I add up, using a protractor, the degrees of each angle in a triangle, that adds up to that. Isn't that interesting? That's pretty neat. And so then maybe you can start to use some of your deductive logic, and you start to come up with things like the Pythagorean theorem for right triangles. You learn about the properties of the triangle. Well, there's a 90-degree angle here. These other two need to add up to 90 degrees. And hey, look at this. If a squared plus b squared equals c squared, there's all these deductions that you can make. And notice what's happened. You've looked at something in the world and you've experienced it through the senses. You've come up with some of its properties, some things you know about it, and then you use logic or reason, deduction, to learn more about it. And so you generate new knowledge based on an application of reason and deduction and logic to things that you've seen in the world. And Aquinas says, that's awesome, and that's how we do most of what we learn, but does that really apply to God? Well, Aquinas says in some ways, sure. Yeah, like for example, he says, we know that we look in the world and we see that every effect has a cause, right? And so he talks about the first cause. He says we know that there had to be one thing that started it all, right? So we can say that must be God. So we can say something about that. That's a deduction he thinks we can make. But beyond that, I mean, is there anything else that we can say about God? There's not, there's some things. If God was a first cause, he has to have a certain level of power, a certain level of sufficiency. So we could say that. But when you come to something like God is three in one, right? A fundamental Christian truth: Father, Son, Spirit, three persons, one substance. That's probably going to be a bit more than our minds can get around. It's not something we can really deduce based on information that we see out in the world when we're exploring, and then coming up with logical inferences. That's probably just not. We're not going to get there. And Aquinas says there's a reason for that. It's because the substance or the essence of God is beyond human comprehension. Triangles not beyond human comprehension. Triangles are simply mathematical objects that we can learn about. God's more than that. So there are going to be things about the world that we can know without the help of natural reason. Not everyone's going to, or with the help of natural reason, not without that the help of revelation. Not everyone will agree with this in the Christian tradition. Aquinas thinks so. But there are going to be a lot of things about, especially God and who God is and what God is like, that we're going to need some help because God's beyond our comprehension. So truths, whatever they are, whether they're about God, whether they're about the world, revelation, those truths, Aquinas thinks, for the most part, can be figured out on our own. But he says it's really, really hard. He says, think. I mean, here I'm Thomas Aquinas. I'm like one of the smartest guys who ever lived. He followed Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, one of the smartest people who ever lived. And Aquinas says, apprenticing myself to the work of Aristotle. He calls him the philosopher all my life, and I'm just able, kind of barely, to know these things. It's like most folks don't have that opportunity. Most folks don't get to come to seminary and think about these things and read about these things. They have jobs. Some of them, he even says in our reading, some people, when you're a kid, you can't do this stuff. You're full of fire and passion. You're not ready. You're not able to deal with these kinds of truths. You don't have the discipline or the thought. So there's a lot of different reasons why people might not be able to get to these truths on their own. And so he says, even if you could, for the most part, it's actually better to take it on faith. And this is in the Christian tradition, the idea of theology being faith, seeking understanding. We start out with belief, we start out with trust, and then over time, our understanding sort of catches up because we get good enough at practicing the way that we think and act and feel as Christians that these big, crazy truths, God is 3 in 1, for example, God gives himself to us on a cross as a human being. These deep, crazy truths, those things don't make sense up front. We're too busy. We're not disciplined enough in our thinking. We don't have enough time or discipline to spend thinking about these things. We're not going to be able to get there on our own. And so Aquinas says you start out with faith. Start out trusting. And over time, some of these deeper truths will begin to make sense. And I think that brings us back to that first question, the question, can we trust the Bible? We do ministry with a lot of people who are like, yeah, the scriptures are a little bit crazy, right? This is what they'll say. They say, I see stuff in the Bible that I don't see in my day-to-day life. And usually they'll talk about things like miracles or miraculous things, God appearing to people and talking to them. I don't see that in my day-to-day life. That's not something I'm familiar with. The kind of God that's being described there, that just doesn't seem like what I know when I go out to my job or when I'm going to school and I'm talking to people. Why is there this disconnect? And I think what Aquinas would say is he'd say, you got to trust first. And then once you've done that and you've spent some time doing it, your mind will change, your eyes will change, your sense of what the world is like will change, and these things will start to come into sync. And so the things that we've received from tradition, from the tradition of the church, from the tradition of the scriptures, about who God is and what the world is like, will end up actually being true, even if it doesn't seem like it up front. So one of the things that we do when we talk about theology and we talk about revelation is we say we're going to start out with revelation. All we need to do is just give it a shot. Spend some time with it. Live with it. And see if over time the special revelation that God gives us kind of actually helps to make sense out of the regular world that we encounter, the world of triangles and the world of cars and business and being a teenager. And over time, if we set into the rhythms and the logic of the revelation and the tradition, if maybe that other stuff will actually start to make more sense than it did before. Leaves a couple questions open though. I mean, in the tradition there's going to be a lot of people who say, yeah, Aquinas kind of overestimates the power of the reason, of what we call unaided reason without the help of God, reason that's not tempered or fashioned or shaped by revelation. Aquinas is pretty confident that we can know a lot of stuff without God's help, without his revelation, without his revelatory aids. And so there's a question about that that's left open. But either way, whether or not you think that we can do a whole bunch of stuff without God's help, or whether you think we need God's help even for the most basic thoughts and processes, which would be probably more of a reformed type of tradition, regardless of what you think, if you want to know the truth about the universe, both traditions are going to say, you got to start with faith. Start with faith first and give it a chance. Settle into its rhythms. Settle into the rhythms of Scripture. Settle into the way that it sees the world. And then see if the world makes more sense in light of that than it did before.